religion class, if you have culture up here, which is what religion is trying to understand, and that's like the branches and the trunk of the tree, religion would be the roots of a culture, because it's in the myths and it's in the rituals that you actually find meaning, and you see all the symbols that make up essentially what the culture is going to lean on. And so the framework that he's using is something called functionalism. It's one of the many things he kind of blends together to research, this religious group in Trinidad. And I wrote it down here. Essentially, functionalism is something that's it's an analytical framework that's not interested in the history or evolution of religion, but really focuses on how religion functions in a particular social structure or a social context. So in this case, Stephen Glazier, if you read the text, he's really trying, one of the things he's kind of answering is like, okay, you have this spiritual Baptist group that they call themselves Christians, they don't really fit into Orthodox Christianity, they're an oppressed people's religion. How do they work in Trinidad and Tobago? That's one of the questions he's answering in this book. And so, as I said, this text is, this ethnographical account of the function of myths, rituals, and this religious leadership structure of these spiritual Baptists in Trinidad. The research took place over 60 years. And Glazier immersed himself there. He spent multiple summers there. He developed very intentional, real friendships with people there. And he has two main qualitative sources, one that basically every anthropologist uses, and a second one that he became pretty famous for pioneering. So the first one is participant observation. You're immersing yourself in a group, you're becoming an insider in a group, and then you are literally writing down whatever you can to gather as much data about whatever it is you're trying to analyze. And he does this over 6 years. And the second thing he uses that I felt was really interesting was he used what's called informants. And he got informants from across the board, from different socioeconomic statuses, from different racial groups, from different cultural groups, from even different religious backgrounds, because he had, I think, 240 of these informants. And what he used these informants to do was to kind of function as a social double blind. That's my term, it's not his. But the idea was, I'm a white guy from the US, and I'm researching, the spiritual Baptists, who are mostly the ancestors, if not entirely the ancestors of enslaved people. What if my informants don't want to be honest? Or what if the people in front of me are hiding some religious practice from me? Well, I can have these informants go who fit in, who are part of the group, that will tell me the truth. And so it's almost like a double blind to that, qualitative research that he's doing, which I thought was really interesting because, it doesn't make sense that, religious people or oppressed people groups might not be honest with someone that they would perceive to be their oppressor, especially historically in Trinidad. And so one of the things that he's going to do in the text is he's going to be contrasting his study with 3 earlier studies. And what he's trying to kind of show is over this period from 1934 to 1958 to 1970 to when he's doing his research and when he eventually publishes it, Trinidad goes through all these different social changes. And the spiritual Baptists go from being targeted by the white government, essentially, as we'll learn, to occupying positions of authority in society. And he wants to be able to track those changes. And, he kind of seeks to do this, in order to accomplish 2 goals. The first of which is kind of updating the academic understanding of the religious situation in Trinidad, and he studied other religious groups. And the second is to kind of challenge established theory that exists in the above studies. He challenges 3 things. He wants to challenge this kind of old syncretistic understanding of religions, where spiritual Baptists are just a blend of African religions and Orthodox Christianity. He'll actually say that they're kind of not. He disagrees with the people before him. And he does this by leaning on something called symbolic interactionism. And what that is that humans create meaning, and that meaning is negotiated, and every single individual kind of contributes to that meaning. And we'll see how this comes together full circle. and structural functionalism, which is what I explained earlier, about functionalism, but it gives structure, to society and stability. And what I feel like his real goal was in this first bit of research he did was to actually make a name for himself. And he was pretty successful in doing that, in my opinion. And here we actually have a photo of a Spiritual Baptist gathering. This wouldn't be one of his photos because it's much too, high quality. But he participated in these rituals, and he would go to these church gatherings across 6 churches across 6 years. So he's building these relationships with these people. He gathered all sorts of data. It's kind of ambiguous whether or not he got their consent. And I read a book review that said that it was actually unethical of him to record these people without their consent if it did happen, but no one's confirmed to deny this. But he has audio recordings of 14 services you can actually go and listen to. He has photographs of ceremonies and religious sites. He got somehow his hands on financial records, and he, got a lot of essentially historical documents concerning spiritual Baptists and what the government was going to do with them over history in University of the West Indies, which is essentially the university of all the West Indies colonies from, the UK. And another thing he got that I thought was really cool was he cites 2 personal diaries of 2 of the big leaders that exist in this movement. And just so that we can explain the faith he's looking at, the Spiritual Baptist faith, it isn't, when I first heard that term, I wasn't aware that these folks existed. I was like, oh, that might be like the Southern Baptist faith. They sound like a Protestant group. They're not. They are syncretist, but he pushes back on that, so I don't want to say that. But essentially, the religion was created by enslaved Africans in what used to be, the West Indies, colonies. So St. Vincent, the Grenadines, Tobago, Grenada, and the Virgin Islands. And it combines elements of traditional African religion and Christianity. And Glazier will go on to say that this religion actually combines things from Hinduism and Buddhism and all these different global religions. And what we need to know is that in 1917, coming out of, being an enslaved people group and all the systemic issues that come along with that, Trinidad and Tobago actually passed a Chowder Prohibition Ordinance that specifically targeted this religious group and prohibited their practices. And they went through this period from 1917 to 1951, which is about 15 to 20 years before he conducts his field work, but in the middle of the prior researchers doing their field work, where they're essentially silenced, and they're not just the religion of the oppressed, they're literally being silenced by the actual government until 1951. And what Glazier is looking at is, okay, so you have this oppressed people group who has this religion that they created for a reason, which we'll get to, and they're at the very bottom of society, and now they're being silenced. Literally, their worship services are banned. 1951 happens, and then they seem to start integrating into the other social institutions in society, but not in a unified way, which is weird. It's not like, we can think of like Protestants, they leave the Catholic Church, and then there's some turmoil, but eventually, within a couple hundred years or something, you have Protestants not necessarily unified, but they have the same central myths and beliefs and rituals, especially Orthodox Protestants. These folks don't, and yet they're still able to integrate with the other social institutions of society. And when we look at, the Spiritual Baptist religion, I would say, and I think they would say, that, they're, oops, did I go one extra one? Yeah. They're outside of Orthodox Christianity themselves, or Orthodox Christianity. They wouldn't call themselves polytheistic, but Glazier, probably because of his religious background and the MDiv and STM degrees he got, these are Christian degrees, he actually calls them polytheistic. And so this is a polytheistic faith because they actually believe, in Christianity you have the Father, Son, and Spirit, and they're one entity, but 3 distinct persons. That's the Orthodox position. Well, they would say no, each member of the Trinity is actually a different entity on its own. So they're 3 different gods. And they also believe in different spirits as well, that seem to have a lot of Buddhist or Hindu influence, or I guess not Buddhist influence, but Hindu influence, or even Asian influence, and certainly African influence. And when you look at the symbols of the religion, they tend to represent justice, righteous living, deliverance, victory over death, and really the Holy Spirit, almost like charismatics and different charismatic Protestants would have, the Holy Spirit giving you hope and giving you life. And I think this is important because, again, you're dealing with this people group, this religion of this oppressed people who've experienced pain and trauma and suffering for generations. This religion was created in that context, and then even into the 1900s, they're being silenced until 1951. And so this whole faith kind of, if you want to think about it this way, grabs whatever it can to give these people hope against the backdrop of government oppression, of racial oppression, of all these different beliefs. And that leads all these different folks here, Herskovitz, Simpson, Bastide, these prior researchers, to say, well, there's this is just a syncretistic religion that should be almost ignored or not taken as its own thing. But what Glazier says is like, no, listen, like these different elements, they're not syncretistic. If people make their own meaning, it means that people create their own religions all on their own. It's not like, you have these different elements of Hinduism and Christianity, for example, or African faiths within this belief system, and it's like an oil, water, and separation. This is all my own language, but it's almost like you've emulsified it. Like you've brought together these two distinct substances of oil, Christian ideas and Jesus and baptism and things, and water, which could be Hinduism or the African religions, and you perfectly blended them together like a fine French sauce. And you start to see this because parts of their religion seem really, really Christian, but then other parts of their religion seem really African, but there's no harsh distinction between the two. They're almost entirely, uniform in not uniform, but they tend to link together, which is strange from a religious studies perspective. And you see this in their rituals. They do some things differently. So for them, baptism actually precedes belief in Jesus, which is normally not the way that Protestants would do it. And Christ himself doesn't necessarily represent a God that dies for you. He represents cosmic and personal justice, which is what this people group would have been hungry for. It has to be done in a stream of living water is the exact phrase that they still use to this day. And the reason for that is there's all this death around you because of, enslavement, because of this, because of that, because of working on the plantations, because of the SPO laws and all these things. And so baptism is allowing you to believe in hope and justice, if that makes sense. They have another ritual I thought was interesting, which is mourning. You take 3 to 7 days and you deny yourself in every possible way. Eating, drinking, speaking, comfort. You use the earth for a bed and the stone for a pillow. And then everyone fasts and prays for you. And the aim is personal spiritual development through getting these visions and spiritual knowledge and understanding. And so this whole thing is like a blend of these different elements of these different religions. So the denying yourself could be almost any religion, but it does seem very like monastic. And then you have a connection to nature where you're using for a bed and stone for a pillow, and you're getting these visions, which seems very, like a traditional Native American or African religion. The idea that the whole community is fasting and praying with you, and this isn't something you're experiencing, seems very Eastern. And Glazier kind of talks about this. I saw this more in book reviews I read about his work and his writing, but it kind of points to that fact that there's almost perfect emulsification of all these different religious ideas. And what he takes in what he really focuses on in the second half of the book is these 22 offices within the Spiritual Baptist congregation. So there's different titles and different roles. You can be a judge, a shepherd, a watchman. And despite there being 22 ranks, there's actually 10, or there's 22 positions, let's say, but there's 10 actual ranks. And one's rank is determined is actually through that morning ritual. So, you'll have these dreams and visions, and then someone else will interpret them for you. And in the past, these other researchers said, no, it's all about the content of the dream. And Glazier says, yeah, it was about the content of the dream and the mystical power when they were being oppressed. Now that this people group is actually in charge of the island, not entirely, but they have a lot of power, now it's more about preserving the interpreter's power. So imagine you're like, oh, I want to become a spiritual Baptist. And you go and you have a baptism, and they say, okay, do the morning ritual so we know where you fit in our hierarchy. In the past, it would have been, well, what dream did you have? What charismatic gift do you have? Now it's, okay, if you're too ambitious and I'm the interpreter, I'm the pastor of the spiritual Baptists, well, I'm going to try to seek and preserve my own power, and so I'm going to try to keep you down. And he actually notes this about 20 years after they get out of that oppressed state, if you will. And he really rejects, a lot of what the old researchers said, not because he thinks their methods are bad or because he thinks they were wrong, but just because the context had changed so much. Because Trinidad went from what it was in the 30s or, even in like the early 50s to what it was in the early 70s. And it was a very different context. And he kind of ends with these theoretical conclusions, which will be our last slide. He uses the experience of spiritual Baptists to basically say that the role of whites has been reduced in Trinidad, and that there's been a lot more acceptance of spiritual Baptists. Their practices were banned for about 40 years, and now they're basically accepted everywhere. And what he'll cite is that, there's a lot of mixed and black persons occupying positions at the top of Trinidadian society, which wasn't the case when the other researchers did their studies, years before. And he writes this, I think it's a good quote. His 240 informants, Baptist informants, are literate, sophisticated, and both willing and able to speak for themselves. And he says this, which I think is profound. I have been much aware that my findings will be discussed and criticized by members of the religion that he's studying, and that anthropologists no longer enjoy a monopoly in the act of interpretation. And so what he's pointing to is when my predecessors did research, they didn't have to argue about what they were interpreting. When I do research and publish on these people are going to read what I write. And so even that's going to be a negotiation, which speaks to how much more powerful spiritual Baptists are and kind of the changing tides of, Trinidad as a place. He also says this, which is really interesting. He uses that above reality to argue that these accepted typologies are not relevant in Trinidad, and that we might actually have to change all of our terminology in terms of religious studies and in anthropology and really sociology, because the guy came up as a sociologist. But they might have to be reimagined. And he writes this. He says the Baptists are too numerous and complex to be considered a cult, which is one space. They're far too active politically to be considered a sect, and they're far too individualistic to be considered a church in the strictest sense of the term. So if you don't know, in sociology and anthropology, there's three terms that kind of define where a religious group is. Are they a cult or are they a sect? So, a sect would be a group that is very pushed out of modernity and pushed out of society. A church would be a united group who kind of share common beliefs, like I described Protestants, even with all their diversity. And what he says is, these people are working together, but they don't seem to agree on basically any of these things. They don't fit any of these molds, so maybe our typologies are broken, which is a really profound argument. And this last quote here kind of shows you who Glazier was or is as a researcher, because he blends all this different theory together to get to his conclusion. He says, ritual change among the Baptists must be understood as a conscious process. So he's saying these people are creating their own meaning. They're not just victims. They're not just, cobbling together beliefs. This isn't some syncretistic religion that we can just ignore. These people are active and agents in empowering themselves. So that's symbolic interaction. That's one theory he's using. This, ritual change is a product of rational decision-making on the part of an individual church leader, often for pragmatic, reasons. And so he's saying there's a function that this religion is playing in society. There's a function and a role that this religious leader has to accomplish and make. And so he's arguing functionalism in the whole group. Symbolic interactionism. Now he's arguing structural functionalism. He just argued chain of typologies, and he says this: spiritual Baptists are an example of what happens when a religion of the oppressed, as this one may have been 20 years ago, joins the establishment. And he uses that to basically blow up this idea of church and sect and cult and say, if you use these three analytical frameworks or, sociological and anthropological frameworks and you assess these people, a lot of what we think we know about typologies and, the establishment of religions just doesn't hold true anymore. And I'd also say there's this commentary on faith systems of the oppressed becoming mainstream as a real indicator of actual social change and ecclesial change. In the past, this was a religion that was created by slaves. Then it was a religion of people who were systemically oppressed and religiously oppressed from 1911 to 52. Now it's the religion of people in power. And, that same demographic is carrying this religion along. So if that's the case, then, we can really see things changing in Trinidad and Tobago. Anyway, I really enjoyed the book quite a bit. So thank you, Dr. Joe, for presenting that. So,
okay. Let me mention that there's a fictional novel by Earl Lovelace about these people called The Wine of Astonishment. I think that's the name of it. It's a quote from Jeremiah, but it's a great book. I read it a while back, and it's a novel about these people who are being persecuted. Very well written. There's also another book I'm reading about Baptists in Trinidad, and the indications are that these spiritual Baptists left the United States after the War of 1812, where the British had promised them if they fought for the British, they would give them their freedom. And of course, it didn't work out. I mean, they had to bring them out of the United States, and I think they initially took them to another island in the Bahamas, but then they brought them to Trinidad and resettled them. And they resettled on the Southside of Trinidad, which is very isolated from the rest of Trinidad, and they interacted a lot with some Africans who were already there who were still practicing African religions. And so that may have been, that could be a little bit of conjecture, but it might be a reason why they picked up some unique characteristics that's not typical of Orthodox Christianity. Good job, Eric, and onwards and upwards. Any comments or questions from Jamie or Eric Goslin?
I'm very passionate about this book. I can tell you that. It shows.
Thank you.
Yeah, Eric is an aspiring anthropologist.
Cool.
Okay, Jamie, you've got my email address. So
I do.
Whenever they close down Canvas, we may have to communicate by email. But just let me know whenever you need something opened.